The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim is the video game title that often gets many praises for a myriad of reasons that often leave many usual players of computer role-playing games confused given the superficiality and particular overfocus on aesthetics by many fanatics of the game. But despite this, there is a possible set of substantive reasons, when weighted in the aggregate, in appreciation for this video game that lends warranting to talk about and maybe scratch something deeper in meaning, considering that there is often confusion on my part given the oversimplification that is often offered for liking the game. Immersion, atmosphere are the two main descriptions that are the common currency for when talking about Skyrim in a video game title. And although it would be sufficient for a casual and perhaps exploratory discussion on Skyrim that would lend for an interesting find into the presumption of preference, I am often not able to find any satisfaction with the anecdotes offered by many people that I have asked for their opinion on Skyrim. To point, I would like to trade the dual word descriptive of atmosphere and immersive for another, more concrete descriptive phrase, aesthetically immersive. Immersive merely describes the after effects of the video game in question, while atmospheric is a more specific property descriptive of what exactly is immersive about the video game in question. A prickly point to make as far as semantics go, but quite to the point to keep me from losing myself in perpetual confusion that seems otherwise an obvious thing for the fanatics of Skyrim. For what makes a game immersive is aesthetics. And what aesthetics are in a video game could range in anything. The music, the colors, the particular specific assets of the video game, the dialogue, the background story, and world building. There are too many of sundry to list, to bother, and I can assume you, my dear audience, can effectively guess everything else. So I'm going to pick a few areas of the video game of which constitute as part of the constellation of aesthetics that make this game interesting to the most pedestrian of players. High dynamic range lighting has been a part of the game Biro and later creation engine that have resulted in image rendering to emphasize light highlights and shadows. This sharp contrasting causes for a more dramatic effect, and combined with the cooler palettes that are used in Skyrim in the skyboxes, textures on the buildings and environs, you can see the visual cues that when I pressed people to tell me what was exactly the visual appeal property for wanting to replay the game again, in particular, the result was an answer that says of the following in short: a combination of how lighting is applied to the environments in combination with coloring choices for the particular environments results for a particular interest to continue playing. In other words, it is the subtle hook that brings the player back. A quick refresh of what high dynamic range lighting is. For Skyrim, or any game that applies this in their game engine, this is a lighting solution that can handle very bright lights and very dark shadows at the same time, similar to how your eyes can adjust readily to in real life. Although in 3D game engines, this is often the standard definition and way of understanding it. But it's important to note that there is something in tandem with this concept of luminescence and shadow environmental processing in a 3D space: coloring gamut range. So if you have more control of lighting and shadow, you have more colors to work with: blacker blacks and whiter whites, and all in between. This particular effect causes for a result for everything in the game too, and pardon the reductive rapper repertoire here. Be making things shining, yo. So similar to an OLED as a hardware solution for near infinite color contrasting, here you have a focus on luminance and shadow simultaneous contrasting. So for those of you who have that played Skyrim vanilla on an LED screen before, I invite you to play this on an OLED or whatever subsequent hardware successor to the OLED display in high resolution and get ready to get your socks knocked off. Consider that Skyrim, much like the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion before it similarly, were way ahead of the curve, where it would be years later that movie remasters would start incorporating HDR coloring and lighting schemes themselves. Oh, and one more thing. If you apply the EMB coloring post-processing modification to Skyrim, the Russian modification by Boris Vorontsov, you'll be able to further explore and see the variations of color palette play on top of what the creation engine has allowed to be possible at the baseline. Jeremy Soul's music, featured in the Elder Scrolls 3, Elder Scrolls 4, and in Elder Scrolls 5. It is the bread and butter that dresses and finalizes the epic imagery that Skyrim is supposed to impress upon players. And it has a certain quality of refinement and elegance that lends to a degree of influence in the participation of the game. Everything that you do, even as something as mundane as buying a house with no mortgage, God bless you if you could do this in real life, by the way, stands to be seen and felt as a mythic action by the player because of the music. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Buying a home over in Whiterun is something tantamount to buying a McMansion for just under $100,000 over in West Sacramento, California, and it feels really, really epic. I think I need to go take a cold shower now. But the point being is that the music is so smooth, so rich, delicate, and delectable that it is like speaking Frenches to the English mind. It will make you feel like as if you're wiping your butt with a refreshing anointed silk rag. You see, it's no wonder that some streamers, like calling centers with a select set of relaxing jazz music loops, will often use Soul's music when addressing to their audiences. And given Soul's satirical referenced origins, the music itself manages to transition and distinguish itself from initial humorous recognition into gradual receipts of appreciation by many who were soothed and lulled by it. To which all I can say is, Enya, eat your heart out. Because even the battle music, albeit aggressive at times, isn't so focused on the character for all thematic categories in the Skyrim music repertoire. It is very Mozart-like and classical period compositional-wise in terms of the qualities whereupon the emphasis in music composition was set to make tranquil, undemanding music, which always allowed for the audience to focus and unfocus from the music itself at will. This means that Soul's music was not causing the player to distract attention away from their playable avatar, but to remain undisturbed and focused. And with this steady repeat musical implicatory help, we have the makings of what quickly begins to make sense with repeat claims of appreciation of aesthetics, which lends to the game itself being described ad nauseum as immersive. To describe Soul's music can be described as follows. With a heavy emphasis of a solo-oriented wind section of an orchestral arrangement, the strings, namely the first and second violin sections, often serves the purpose of leading melody performances. The usual basso continuo performed by the lower strings with the cello, viola, and bass. And although I don't believe Soul had the money for a full-scale symphony orchestra for partial usage of string track layering and reverberations during mixing, could have given me the impression of an actual symphony orchestra being employed. But that's just speculation on my part. But the first and second violin sections would not only serve for leading melody preferences as a Soul flute would suffice to do solo performances at times with an accompanying string and horn sections, English or French horns, I'm not quite sure. As for percussion, I would say that the usual suspects for a Hollywood style, usage of timpani, cymbals, mallets. I'm not sure if a gong was deployed somewhere. Used somewhere in the performances of any of the tracks. If it was, it was a very large cymbal at the most. Or at the least, I'm not sure. And of course, some limited use of the snare drum. All in all, the end result is, although the typical post-romantic Hollywood vulgarities for theatrical sake, You get some of the most beautiful sweeps every so often to really stress on the whole idea of panoramic vistas, mountain ranges, fjord-like valley structures, and geography that imply a grit as to the people that live in the land of Skyrim. Although considering that Skyrim is in of itself a holistically, over-exaggerated as far as video game settings go, it's no wonder why this entire game, between so far coloring and music scores, composition, that you really have now 2 for 2 as far as hooks go to bring you back to this game. I think I'm getting somewhere. In architecture, terms such as heroic scaling or the sublime, or even in latter-day professional architectural parlance, monumental scaling, are more or less used for addressing the question of how large a building is to be designed. But it covers more. Usually it's a term to make people aware that there will be an emphasis of not just enormity and grandness of scale to what is typical of daily life in most people's lives, for the purposes of evoking a much impression of awe to those that will be around, inside, and anywhere near the building. This requires many hours of researching of the kinds of building materials that will be applied, the designs of decoration both outside and within the structure, in order to get away with the following details, such as what furnishings and what particular color schemes will be applied inside as well as out of the structure. Much is the case to be found of observation, to some degree, in the Nordic crypts and the ancient dwarven dwellings that you find throughout Skyrim. Mythology and lore drive the beliefs of the Nordic people in Skyrim, and although there are many of Nord that have admitted in the game that to some degree they've forgotten the ancient ways, there are those that even the most modern Nords will recall the monuments that lie peppered throughout the frozen tundra of the Skyrim province. Throughout the game of Skyrim, you have architecture that is often, even among the structures provided by authors of modifications that amend assets to the game, follow a design language of simply bigger is better. When it comes to the most obvious examples, such as Bleak Falls Barrow, you can immediately understand at once, compared to the living quarters and scenes just east in Riverwood, that there's a contrast between the modern and latter day in Skyrim to that of the past, dead and mythic. And considering that, as a Dragonborn, you are put to task to adventure among the dead and find things usually hidden among the past and forgotten while doing so. So, while many of the living in Skyrim enjoy comforts and private lives in the austere scales of humble, small living of their situations as a result of a civil war, it is in the midst of civil war that the past of gargantuan might is reflected upon by the large-scale stone dwellings of the dead, and even in the formal seats of power of the Skyrim rulers of both old and present. Consider Whiterun, Markath, Solitude, Windheld, Winterhold, Dawnstar, Riften, and Ivarstead, all pertaining some echo of the past or near past, with more of the northern westward portions of Skyrim, in particular even with specifically focusing on Dawnstar, Solitude, and Markath and Whiterun, being the cities that have stories that make their reason for being not merely based on promises of economic financial opportunity to many citizens. These are cities that offer stories that in turn give the impression to anyone that wants to live there that what they'll be doing is participating in living in not just a living monument of history, but be part of a living monument of history that continues to make history by just simply still being present. And to reflect this message, you have the enormous structures of scale that exude the obvious as far as what you need to know as a player of the role of the Dragonborn. But along with that, there is the exudance of mystery to get you to want to know more and to do more, so that with doing so, you explore further these cities and places of import and of forgetfulness of many of modern Skyrim, such as ancient Nordic barrows. A habitual online reductionist will abuse often observation and detail and about contrasts and relationships of opposition and diametrical controversy, and really in favor of just simply having a person to focus on relative commonality. And this, I can only respond as, well, I can understand how it seems obvious to some people, but given how obviously the setting and pretext in general is of an epic setting. But that's the thing. The contrast of scale of architecture and how spaces for certain specific kinds of gameplay have a direct effect of where adventures take place and the manners of how your playable character interacts with the world around them, depending on how serious to how quaint. So the relationship could be that the grander the scale, the serious the activities to do in that space in the game world. Likewise, vice versa. The smaller the space, the more jocular and mundane. And because these environmental shifts provide a consistency throughout the world, it becomes a subtle hook that brings the player back again and again. The option to visit a particular reserved area for adventuring versus a reserved area for mundane interactions with NPCs and such, that is the kind of tit for tat that oftentimes gets a lot of people to really get themselves interested in being a part of the world of Skyrim. I can understand why Skyrim is loved by many. It isn't a traditional role-playing game that you would see from Western developers and publishers. Indeed, most of the time, Western-developed role-playing games, unlike that of the Japanese, are not as streamlined. And you can say that a lot of Japanese role-playing games are just as, if not maybe even more so, streamlined than Skyrim. So I guess you could say, I mean, if you really wanted to be jocular about it, you can absolutely say, yeah, Skyrim is a Japanese-American role-playing game. But then again, I think some people would find that somewhat insulting for some reason. The thing is that when you look at the properties of experience versus mechanical consciousness in terms of your gameplay, if you're familiar with tabletop role-playing games, you would see the contrast between something like Warhammer 40k, Dungeons & Dragons, or Kingdom Death, or Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, with the last game being the one that has the storyteller system. The storyteller system usually involves what usually would be the dungeon master's job to simply keep track of scores, damages, and do a little bit of thespian work in order to get people to understand the setting in the most basic way. But in the storyteller system, you have to be more emotive and performative. In other words, it's the thespian part that gets more foreplay than the actual declarations of statistics and facts about the setting, the enemies, the statistics about everything that you need to know about every part of the scenario of which all the players are going to be finding themselves in. So, in similarity, one is about typical amounts of complexity, which is standard in most role-playing games, and the other is about feeling. And Skyrim is most certainly about feeling. When you play the older installations of the Elder Scrolls series, you'll find that it is more in line to something like Wizardry or any other Dungeons & Dragons derivative or inspired, mechanically oriented role-playing games. Currently, as of the time of this recording, I'm co-playing a game with a friend called Divinity Original Sin 2. And even though the game has many of the particularities of which you would find in something like Dungeons & Dragons, or something that would be reminiscent to Wizardry, but you would find yourself most of the time seeing a striking balance between narration simply emoting certain properties and sometimes going out of the way to project a certain particular form of description, then delegating a voice actor to fulfill the character dialogue. This is about enough as it is necessary to put two and two together, given that visuals and sound effects are, along with the soundtrack, sufficiently ongoing and employ to get the players to understand that, hey, this is happening and this is how it's going to feel like happening. But in the case of Skyrim, you're left with open-ended vagaries at every turn. And this opens more for the player instead of the game to be able to dictate the terms of the experience. In other words, it's reflective and recursive. So when you have colors and lighting that give this form of projection that is mysterious as well as implicit to the direction that the game wants you to understand its world, people will come back. When you have a soundtrack that pinpoints the very finer aspects of the game's setting, that complements the visual cues that you find, whether it's in the skyboxes, whether it's in the structures of the buildings of the game world, or when you find yourself in the particular places and combat situations that you're in, or in the quest lines that you are preoccupying yourself with, the music will always be there to accompany you and be complementary to the very sensations and feelings that you are having as you are going through them. And finally, when you have architecture that reflects the scale of both what is mythic, epic, immersive, and serious, as well as the quaint and mundane, well, of course, once again, the hook will bring you back. And this trifecta of hooks are the subtle hooks that I believe get a lot of people to come back to play this game and consider it one of their favorite games. I don't suppose that being dictated and being made conscious of statistics is something that most people look for when playing a role-playing game, regardless of whether it's a Western or a Japanese video game of such category. What people want is an experience. What people want is an escape, a more participatory form of escapism. Participatory instead of passive, because passive, well, I mean, if you want that, you go watch a movie or read a book. But in video games, this is where video games shine the most, where participation is going to be part of not just merely enacting out a fantasy, but enacting out a role of which, hypothetically, you could have been if the setting was real. Give or take a couple of liberties and suspensions of disbelief. That goes without saying. But the point is that despite all of what I just said, I can say confidently that, yes, I do think that the game still sucks. But two, I can understand its appeal all the same to the many, many people out there that have cited this game as not only being their favorite, but also being the gateway game for all other role-playing games, whether they are Western or Japanese. So for that, I salute people over at Bethesda who worked on this game at the time, and for anybody who still continues to support this game, which, by the by, I should mention that modifications is the last, but not subtle, hook that brings Skyrim to a lot of people over and over again. You see, modifications for this game have even made, at this point, many years later, careers into the video games industry, and which still is often well supported, and often there's a lot of contention and discourse and infighting in order to maintain the aftermarket economy of this game's modification scene going. It's really quite a fascinating thing to read all over the internet. And I have modified my games as well, with both Oblivion and Skyrim. So, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope that you find yourselves maybe taking Skyrim a second look. It's been many years. It will require some patches, and maybe some modifications. But whatever you do, just don't overdo it on the modifications. That's not the point of the game. All right. Well, until then, I'll see you around.
I squeeze the cat, I squeeze the cat, I squeeze the cat, I squeeze the cat, I squeeze the cat. Till my clips is empty. Till my clips is empty. I squeeze the cat.